This happened to me about a month ago, and frankly, I'm still sleeping with a chair jammed under the bedroom door. I don't live in a city, but my place isn't quite the true outback either. I'm on the fringes of a small country town in Gippsland, Victoria. My property backs onto a section of the Tarabulga National Park, what locals call the Bush, a massive, tangled scrub, massive old mountain ash trees, and dense ferns. One side of the house borders this wild bushland, but the real issue lies past that. It's about 1.5 kilometers through the trails to an old logging road. Follow that road for a short distance and you hit a fenced-off area. It's not a reservoir, but a deep water hole, a permanent billabong nestled in a rock formation. It's always been surrounded by the same aggressive 10-foot-tall barbed wire fence, crisscrossed with faded signs reading, "Private land, trespassers will be prosecuted." Growing up, I'd always assumed it was something to do with the logging company or maybe a government water test site. But just like the water in your story, I could never find a name for this thing on any map. It's just a blank spot. My dad, who was born here, told me to forget about it. He said the oldest Aboriginal stories called it a bunyip hole and warned that it was a place where things that shouldn't live do. I always found that kind of strange. I'm training for an ultra-marathon, so I'm always looking for a long, quiet route. That bush track and the road loop have become my regular 10-kilometer circuit. It's way better than running the dusty main roads where people drive way too fast. The weather was warming up fast, and I was increasing my distance. The day everything started, I was making my way back to the thickest part of the fern gully. The air was dead still. I could have sworn I heard something deep and wet grunt behind me. Not a normal animal sound, but like a vast, heavy sigh. I figured it was just an old swamp wallaby, but I pushed myself faster until I was back in my yard. Fast forward to that night. I always sleep with the window cracked to let in the cool evening air. I love the sounds of the bush, the rustle of possums, the hum of insects. And boy did it rain that night, a fierce, sudden storm. I was drifting off listening to the rain hammer the iron roof when I heard something that definitely wasn't the storm. It was a soft, high-pitched whimpering, almost like a distressed baby or a young child. The sound was coming from right beneath my window, and the more I listened, the more impossibly sorrowful it became. Then, a voice, thin and clear as broken glass, cut through the noise. It was a woman, and she said, "Please, can you help me? I've been left in the water." I've never been so instantly cold in my life. The fear was primal, but the urgency was stronger. I thought someone had fallen into a creek swollen by the storm. I'd burst out of bed, grabbed the heavy magnolite torch by the door, and sprinted around the side of the house. The rain was pelting so hard it felt like hail. But I didn't care. I needed to do something. As soon as I turned the corner, the light hit her. Huddled right underneath the window, trying to shelter under the narrow eaves, was a woman. She was wearing what looked like a thin, white, soaked dress or nightgown. Her skin looked pale and slightly blue in the beam. I approached cautiously, torch steady, and asked if she was hurt. That's when it went from a rescue mission to a nightmare. As soon as the beam hit her face, she sprang up. Her eyes were impossibly wide and dark, and she let out a choked, wet noise that wasn't a sob. It was more like a gurgling hiss. She didn't rush toward me, but toward the light. I saw her mouth open, wider than it should be, revealing teeth that looked too long, too blunt. I didn't wait. I backed up, ready to swing the torch, but mid-stride she deviated. She turned with an unnatural, staggering speed and darted away, not along the path, but directly into the impenetrable dark bush. She disappeared instantly, running with the horrific splashing gait like she was moving through knee-deep water despite the solid ground. I immediately bolted back inside, drenched and shaking, and woke my wife. We talked about calling the local police, but what would I say? A psychotic blue woman with a creepy smile ran into the national park in a storm? We decided to secure the house and deal with it in the morning. The next few days were normal, and we chalked it up to a runaway patient from a distant psychiatric ward. But what happened next wasn't normal. Maybe 5 days after the first incident, I was on my run, but I kept my distance from the bush, sticking to the road. As I approached the section with the barbed wire fence, I stopped. There, down by the dark water's edge, partially obscured by the thick reeds, was the woman. I froze. How was she even there? That fence is a serious industrial barrier, 10 feet high, topped with razor wire. There are no access gates for kilometers. I must have gasped, because even from that distance, she slowly turned her head. There was no doubt this was her. Her face was still pale, and her soaked white dress clung to her. She looked at me, and that impossibly wide, unnatural smile spread across her face. Then she did something sickening. She didn't just stand up, she rose out of the water like a waterlogged doll. And then she began to run directly towards the fence. I yelled, "I'm calling the police!" She didn't stop. She ran right up to the wire, pressing her face and her slick, wet hands against the metal mesh, silent now, just grinning. Then, in one sudden horrifying movement, she didn't climb or crawl through the wire. She turned and dove straight back into the black water. But she didn't swim. She sank immediately, not with a struggle, but like a stone, the dark surface closing over her head without a ripple. I called the police, explained the trespasser, and gave a frantic description. They eventually showed up, took my statement, and promised to patrol the area. I haven't seen her since, but I've stopped running the route entirely. Now, at night, I don't hear a cry. I hear a heavy, wet, dragging sound outside my window. Something large moving slowly through the wet ferns. My sister's boyfriend, one of those local conspiracy types, came over. He looked up the area and found a hidden map by cross-referencing old land deeds. The waterhole isn't a reservoir. It's listed as a sacred place on one map and a disposal site on the other. He's convinced the government is hiding something that's polluting the water. But I think it's simpler. I think that fence wasn't put up to keep people out of the waterhole. I think it was built by settlers long ago to keep whatever lives in the water from getting out of the billabong. And whatever it is, I think it finally succeeded in sending something to find me. This happened to me 6 weeks ago, and every single night since I've had to run an extra heavy-duty deadbolt on the back door. I don't exactly live on a main road. My house is in a tiny historic town in Tasmania's Midlands, a region where the old penal settlements are just part of the landscape. Lots of crumbling stone, harsh scrub, and that kind of thing. One side of our house borders what I'd call the old convict track. It's not much of a road anymore, just a barely maintained dirt strip that cuts through the wilderness and connects to a few other properties. This track runs parallel to what I guess you could call the town's historical monument, a long, brutal stretch of sandstone wall. It's only about 8 feet high, but it runs for maybe a kilometer before it just stops in the middle of nowhere. It's too tall to climb easily, and there are old rusted iron spikes on the top. Here's the weird thing. The name of the stretch, the chain wall or the hunger wall as the locals call it, isn't mentioned on any historical tourist maps, which it definitely would be if it were an official monument. I always found that kind of strange. I've asked the local library about it multiple times, but there's never any official information on its purpose, only hushed stories about the men who built it. I'm an amateur historian and runner, so I'm always looking for a good route. That old convict track has become my go-to. It's exactly a 5-mile loop along the wall, down a service road, then back around. It's quieter than running in the actual town and offers a brutal, desolate backdrop. The weather was getting cold, so I had recently ramped up my runs. The day everything went down, I could have sworn I saw a shadow move behind the wall's narrow stone vents as I was making my way back. But I figured it was just the sun catching the moss. Fast forward to that night. During winter, I always sleep with my bedroom window closed, but that night I'd forgotten to latch it tightly. I love the sounds of the wind whipping across the exposed Midlands at night.
And boy, did the wind blow that night. A massive front came in from the coast, rattling everything. I was lying in bed, listening to the wind and the old house groaning, when I heard something that definitely wasn't the weather. It was soft at first, but it didn't go away. It was this faint scratching or tapping sound. And the more I listened, the more it sounded like it was coming from the stone patio right beneath my window. And the more distinctly metal on stone it sounded. As if there was any doubt, a low, guttural male voice cut through the wind. It was weak, almost a desperate rasp, but it said clear as day, "Water. Give me the water. The chain is cold." I've never moved so fast in my life. It was like my instinct to flee was completely overridden by a paralyzing fear. I crept out of bed, grabbed the heavy walking stick I keep next to the door, and slowly moved to the window. I pulled the curtain back just a fraction. Huddled right underneath my window was a man wearing tattered, heavy, dark clothes that looked unnervingly like a wool jacket and worn trousers, like something from a period drama. He was crouched low, his head down, as if trying to shield his face from the wind. His skin looked strangely drawn and yellow in the faint yard light. I approached the window cautiously and asked what he wanted. But then things went from 0 to 100 in a matter of seconds. As soon as he heard my voice, he shot upright. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his mouth was a stretched, dry line. Instead of speaking, he let out a choked, desperate sound, and I saw his hands. They weren't empty. They were shackled with a heavy iron chain running between his wrists, worn smooth by decades of friction. Without much time to react, I slammed the curtain shut and threw the deadbolt. I stood there in shock as I heard a desperate scrape of metal against the sandstone patio and a sound like a choked sob. I woke my partner up. When I told him what happened, he was just as freaked out as I was. We made sure every door and window was locked. We talked about calling the police, but it was after midnight and they were 45 minutes away. Plus, what could they do? Patrol an invisible figure in antique clothes? I managed to fall back asleep eventually, and the next couple of days were completely normal. We talked the whole thing up to one of two explanations: a homeless person or a very convincing and disturbing local prankster. But what happened that night wasn't the end of the ordeal. In fact, it was more like the beginning. Maybe a week after the initial incident, I was going on one of my usual runs. As I was making my way along the convict track, I happened to glance up at the great stone wall. To my surprise, there was actually movement right up on the top of the wall. There, silhouetted against the pale morning sky, was the man. I froze in complete terror. I mean, how was he even up there? The wall is sheer sandstone, 8 feet high and topped with those brutal iron spikes. I must have made some kind of noise because even though I was pretty far away, he suddenly turned his head and looked directly at me. In that moment, there was no doubt in my mind that he was the same man who had been underneath my bedroom window. The moment he saw me, he began to move, not running, but scuttling along the top of the wall, his iron chain glinting in the sun, moving impossibly fast and with an unsettling crab-like motion. I yelled that I was calling the police, hoping that would scare him off. And I guess it did, because as soon as I said that, he simply fell forward off the wall. It was an awkward, bone-jarring drop, yet I heard no sound of impact. He just disappeared into the dense, harsh scrub on the other side. I called the police immediately, and I tried to explain the situation. A man in old clothes fell off the historical wall. They took my statement and promised to check the perimeter. They told me to go about my day normally, which I was kind of shocked by. I haven't seen him again since then, but I've started hearing that faint metallic scratching outside my bedroom window at night. Not just tapping, but the unmistakable sound of a heavy link of iron being dragged across the stone. It's making me really paranoid, and I just know something else is going to happen. I get that he's probably a lost soul or a ghost of a convict who was worked to death on the wall, but what remains the biggest mystery to me is how he was on top of that spiked wall in the first place, or how he moves so fast. I've spent hours looking for a natural gap or a ladder. I'm telling you, it's impossible. But I've never felt more unsettled than I do now in my own home.
This happened a couple of years ago when I was in my early 20s, working as an armed security guard to pay my way through college. My shifts were grueling, 7 p.m. to 3 a.m., and this particular night I was wiped out, but had plans to visit a friend in a nearby town the next day. I figured I'd grab a bottle of soda as a small gesture for him, though I can't recall the brand now. What happened in that parking lot, though, is burned into my memory. My shift ended, and as usual, I was too lazy to stow my gear properly. Instead of locking my pistol belt holster and gun in the trunk, like protocol demanded, I tossed them onto the back seat of my beat-up sedan. It was a careless move, but it turned out to be a lifesaver. My neighborhood was rough around the edges, and there was a small convenience store in a strip mall with a flickering street light that barely lit the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. It was about 3:30 a.m., and the lot was nearly empty. Just a few scattered cars under the dim orange glow. I pulled into a spot close to the store, bought the soda, and was walking back to my car when I saw her. She came stumbling around the corner from the direction of some shuttered doctor's offices across the lot. She was young, maybe my age, with shoulder-length blonde hair and a white shirt covered in little pink flowers. Her eyes were wide with panic, and she was clutching something in her hand. At first, I thought it was a gun, and my heart jumped into my throat. "Shit," I muttered, freezing by my car door. "He's following me," she shouted, her voice high and frantic, as she locked eyes with me. She was moving fast, nearly tripping over herself, heading straight for me. "He's following me," she repeated, and then I heard a sharp click. Not a gun, but a stun gun. The kind that sparks and crackles. She waved it in the air, her hands trembling. "He's following me," she said again, her voice breaking. I opened my car door, trying to keep my cool. "Who's following you?" I asked, scanning the lot. The air was thick, the kind of quiet that makes your ears hum. Then, from the same corner she'd come from, this guy appeared. He was tall, like basketball player tall, bald, wearing a blue tank top that showed off arms like tree trunks, and in his right hand, catching the streetlight's glow, was a knife. Not a pocket knife, but a big, ugly hunting knife, the kind you'd use to gut a deer. "That's my piece," he said, his voice low and steady, eyes fixed on the girl. He didn't even glance at me, just kept walking across the parking lot, his boots scraping the asphalt. I looked at the girl, now standing a few feet from my car, gripping her stun gun like it was all she had. "Is he with you, or is he the one following you?" I asked, trying to make sense of it. For all I knew, they were together, maybe running from someone else. But she shook her head, her voice shaky. "He's following me." "Go into the store," I told her, pointing to the convenience store's entrance about 20 feet away. "Tell them to call 911. This was years before I had a cell phone, actually about 7 years, so that was her best bet. She nodded and ran toward the store, her shoes slapping against the pavement. The guy kept coming, repeating, "That's my piece," his knife still raised. He was closing the distance across the parking lot now, maybe 15 feet away, his shadow stretching long and distorted under the streetlight. I reached into the back seat, grabbed my pistol belt, and strapped it on, turning my hips so he could see the holster. My hand rested on the grip of my 9mm, hoping he'd back off. No dice. He kept walking, saying, "That's my piece," like a mantra. My pulse was racing, but I'd been in tight spots before. I'd done a stint in the Army infantry, seen combat, and knew how to stay calm. Still, this felt off, pointless, almost absurd, unfolding in a grimy parking lot at 3 a.m. He was close now, maybe 10 feet, and that knife looked even nastier up close. I drew my gun, aimed at his chest, and said, "Here's my piece." He stopped, but he didn't drop the knife. His eyes narrowed, staring me down, the blade still gleaming in his hand. The parking lot felt like it shrank to just us, the tension thick enough to choke on. "How about you go on your way and have a good night?" I said, keeping my voice even though inside I was thinking, damn it, he's going to make me shoot him. I didn't want to. I'd seen enough death to know it wasn't something I wanted on my soul, especially not over some random parking lot standoff. I pulled the hammer back on my pistol, the click cutting through the quiet night, and repeated, "Go on your way and have a good night." For a moment, he didn't budge, just stared, knife still up. Then finally, he took a step back. "Sorry, man," he said, his tone softer now. "Thought you were somebody else." He lowered the knife, tucking it into his back waistband, and started backing away toward the store, the same one the girl had run into. I kept my gun on him until he turned and disappeared through the store's door. Only then did I exhale, my hands trembling slightly as I holstered my weapon. I got in my car, the bottle of soda still sitting on my passenger seat, untouched. Across the parking lot, catty-corner to the store, was another 24-hour convenience store with a sheriff's deputy car parked out front. I decided to report what just happened. I pulled into the other store's lot, parked beside the deputy's cruiser, and walked over. The deputy was leaning against his car, sipping coffee. Before I could even finish explaining, he cut me off. "Bald guy, blue tank top?" "Yeah," I said, caught off guard. "How'd you know?" "We'd been looking for him," he said, his face hardening. "He's been in trouble for weeks." I told him. The guy was in the store across the lot, and the deputy didn't hesitate. He jumped in his cruiser and sped off, tires screeching on the asphalt. I drove home, the parking lot's dim glow fading in my rearview mirror. I couldn't shake how close that encounter had been. If I had left my gun on the back seat, if I'd been a second slower, who knows how it would have played out. I never learned what happened to the girl or the guy with the knife, but that night in the parking lot still haunted me.